Hey guys, Keith here. Coming to the end of the 2020 season and having troubleshot a lot of people having issues with shows not necessarily playing as smoothly as they would like to do, I thought it would be an opportune time to run through some of the common causes of issues when you're running your show, in this case with xSchedule. So to start with, the first and probably the most important thing is making sure that you're pointing at your correct show folder. Your show folder is shown down here. In this case, it's in an amber color. It could be in red or it could be in black. The colors actually mean something. So when it's red, that means you're pointing at a show folder that does not actually contain an xSchedule networks file, which means there is not a chance in hell that xSchedule is going to be able to output anything to any of your controllers, and you will need to fix it. If it's amber, amber's a warning. So what it's saying is, hey, you're pointing at a show folder. It does contain a xSchedule networks.xml file, so it has something there that I could send data out to, but it's not the same as your xSchedule folder. And so it's possible that you're pointing at a folder that you shouldn't be pointing at. So if you're experiencing an issue where you can output to your controllers from xSchedule, but when you go to xSchedule and you try to output, you get garbage, it's not right, etc., and the show folder down here is in amber, likely as not your problem is you're just pointing at the wrong show folder and you need to correct it. And it's pretty easy to do. You just come up to the file menu and switch to the xSchedule folder, and it changes, and now you can see the text has shrunk a bit, it's all turned black, and that indicates that it's now aligned to xSchedule. Now it still may not be right, but it is aligned to xSchedule, so it probably is right. The next thing that you may want to do, and this kind of depends on your machine, but if all of your controllers are accessed via and this is more important if you've got more than one network adapter in your computer, including any funky type adapters, maybe due to the fact that you're running virtual machines or something on your machine. But if you've got more than one adapter, you may want to tell xSchedule which adapter it should be using when it talks to your controllers. Now, this is only possible if there is just one adapter that you want to use. If for some reason you have multiple adapters and you want to talk to one set of controllers via one adapter and another set of controllers via another adapter, then you shouldn't change this setting. But if everything goes out your Ethernet port, you may want to go into the edit options and down to this force local IP and choose one of what will be several IP addresses down here. Now, if you've only got one IP address like I do on this computer at this point in time, there's no need to set this. This obviously can only use this IP address and it's not a problem. The other thing that shouldn't be happening is if you do have multiple IP addresses here, they shouldn't all be, or you shouldn't have multiple of them in the same subnet. That can definitely create confusion when xSchedule is trying to send the data out to the controller. If there's two adapters with the same subnet and they're both on the subnet that your controllers are on, it doesn't really know what path to choose and you can't really predict which one it will choose. So if one's a wired connection and one's a Wi-Fi connection, there is every chance in the world that it will take the Wi-Fi path and be subject to all the sorts of delays that you might experience through a Wi-Fi network. So I would suggest it's fundamentally good practice to make sure that you are using different subnets, particularly if one of those is your show network and it could be and should be independent, then you should definitely put that in a separate subnet. Otherwise, your machine is working overtime at show play time to try and work out what to do, and it's possible it will make the wrong decisions. So you definitely want to play with that. While we're in here, there's a couple other things here. Hardware accelerated video. Look, I never really got this working well on Windows. I believe it works reasonably well on OS X. If you happen to be running one of the supported versions of xSchedule on OS X, you could turn that on. But on Windows, I would generally leave that off. You can try it, but if xSchedule starts to crash on you, then come back in and turn it back off again, because we need to do more work on that. Keeping the computer screen on. Yeah, one of the things when you're playing your show back is you obviously want to watch what happens to your machine when because it's going to be sitting there idle for long periods of time, and you obviously don't want your machine to go into some sort of low power state, because if it goes into a low power state, then obviously it's going to start to slow down potentially, or even turn off, or at least go into some sort of hibernate or suspend mode. And so you're going to want to keep the computer on all the time. One of the ways to do that is actually just to click this checkbox here, and that puts xSchedule into a mode on Windows, which tells the operating system to leave the screen on and leave the process running, and keeps the process running at a good speed. Behind the scenes, all through 2020, there was a change introduced very late in 2019 that automatically bumps the priority of xSchedule while it's playing the show. So when it's not playing the show, like right now, it runs at the same priority as every other task on your machine. But once the show kicks in, xSchedule actually elevates its priority by one level, just to try and stop any sort of background tasks or whatever from taking priority over it, and ensuring you get the best possible playback experience. So you may want to turn this on. I definitely do on my laptop. You can on your laptop, you can dim your monitor down so that it's not so bright, or you can actually turn your monitor off if it's an actual full-size computer, if you don't like the fact that the screen's on all the time. But this will definitely help with performance. There is this option here that was added relatively recent to minimize UI updates for performance. I would generally not turn this on. In extreme circumstances where you've tried everything else and nothing else will work, you may want to turn it on. The reason I wouldn't turn it on is it does disable some of the functionality on the screen here. So all of this ping information will disappear. It will never be displayed. There's also the frame rates, the number of frames that are being sent out, the number of packets that are being sent out, along with the icons that appear down here to show when something's accessing the web page, and I even think the turtle, which indicates that you're getting that lag, will also not display on the screen. So you lose a certain amount of information. Now, you don't lose information on the web page though, so the ping information would still be available on your mobile phone or whatever. It just won't appear on the screen here, and that's because updating the screen here can be a little slow at times, and so doing that's good. I also added this disable output on local ping failure. I'm going to show you a way I think it's better to do than this. The problem with this is if something starts to show up as a ping failure, you can actually start to lose output, because what it will actually do is it will stop sending data to the controller that's not responding to the pings. The problem is well, what if that was just a brief failure or a single failure? You don't really want an entire controller to go offline for a minute while xSchedule waits to come back around and ping the controller and re-establish the connection. So again, in extreme circumstances, maybe you want to do this, but I think I'll show you a little bit later in this video a better way to deal with that particular scenario. Other than that, there's a couple other things that I would recommend here. The first one is you want to eliminate a bunch of unnecessary IP addresses that xSchedule is talking to. One of the common ones is up in Configure FPP Remotes. Now, this is actually used when you've got this FPP unicast, which I don't recommend. We've actually added the preferred label against multicast, because this is what you should be using for if you're doing a synchronization with either other instances of xSchedule or FPP most commonly. Then you should definitely be using this one. But some people do use this, and there are some circumstances where it's kind of useful to use this, like when you're trying to do synchronization, maybe over the internet or over a VPN, and you're trying to route the ping packets across, or the sync packets across the network. Some people will want to use FPP unicast, but just understand that if you start to run into issues with the reachability of this, sometimes it can slow things down. So unless you are using one of those special cases, come into here and make sure that you've deleted any entries that might be in here, because you don't need them. They can cause problems. The other one is you can come down here and right click and add in additional IPs. I actually have my home router in here, which because I run a split network, my show network, and it's also on my home network, and I want to see if it's connected to my home network. Don't go to town on here. Putting my router here is not such a big deal because it's always online. It's very reliable. But if you add a whole bunch of stuff in here that's failing all the time, the ping's not too bad, but I still would keep that to a minimum, particularly if you're suffering issues. The other thing that you should definitely do in this fundamental setup is there is a check schedule here, and check schedule here is just like check sequence in xLights, except it's for xSchedule. And what it will do is just like check sequence, it will go through and it will run a bunch of tests here for problems with your sequences. And here's down here, for instance, is a bunch of issues, because this is not actually my show playing computer, where I haven't rendered the sequences correctly, and so the number of channels are mismatching between my FSCQ file and my networks file, and this could be a sign that there's actually you need to go back and do a batch render and re-render your sequences. So definitely check out in here and look for any problems that might be in here, because it may be a sign of things that might be causing you some issues with xSchedule. So that's some of the fundamental setup stuff in xSchedule that you want to get right. There are some other things that you should think about as well regarding your actual machine. So first of all, you do want to think very carefully about whether you keep your operating system updates turned on during your show season. Some of the Microsoft updates can be quite large and can take quite some time to download, and particularly if you're running this on quite an old laptop like I am, those downloads and even the installs can be just incredibly slow, and that's all well and good if it's occurring at 3 a.m. in the morning and it's done by 7 a.m. and who cares that it took 4 hours. But when you're sitting there half an hour before your show is starting and a Windows update is installing and you have no idea when it's going to finish, you can't interrupt it, very, very frustrating. So I would suggest that you find the appropriate mechanism on your machine to turn off the operating system updates, or at least make them manual and choose the most appropriate time to implement it. The other thing I would do is run Task Manager and check all the processes that are running on your machine. To start Task Manager, just right click on your taskbar and Task Manager will come up, and take a look at all the processes that happen to be running on your machine and kill anything that's not necessary. Because if you're running lots of processes, each and every one of those processes could potentially be stealing important CPU time from your computer when it's trying to play your show and create random and unexpected delays. So try and keep this stuff here to the minimum. Particularly, you want to get rid of your browser. The browser just eats up memory and the like. Zoom, running Zoom's great, but again, particularly when you're in a meeting, this thing goes nuts. You want to keep that stuff as much as possible off your show computer while it's playing, so you don't run into any issues. Virus scanning. Virus scanning's a bit fraught. I would never recommend to someone that you run no protection at all on your machine. But depending on your virus scanner and depending on your settings, you can get yourself into situations which involve it doing a lot of scanning that it doesn't need to do. Particularly, you don't want the virus scanner to be checking out your FSCQ files every time you open a sequence, or your audio files every time you open your sequence. It's just going to slow that process down. You want to, if you can, disable scanning on your show folder, things like that, to try and minimize the disruption caused by your virus scanner. If you really think that your virus scanner is a problem, maybe disable it temporarily, test your show, see if your problems go away. If your problems do go away when you disable your virus scanner, maybe choose a different one. I personally just use the one that Microsoft, the Windows Defender, on my show laptop. It seems to be pretty low impact. Look, it's probably not as good as others, but to be honest, apart from running my show, I don't use it for a great deal of things. So I wouldn't worry about that. Firewalls, now you definitely want to be ensuring that your firewalls allow xSchedule to talk to both your private networks and to public networks. It's more important private networks, I guess, than public networks, but even so, I would enable it for both incoming and outgoing. Incoming, because obviously there is a web server built in xSchedule and you want to be able to access it from your phone, and outgoing because obviously xSchedule needs to send data out to various devices, and so that's important. The internet access, mainly that's important for things like, Remote Falcon, or if you're running the SMS plugin where it's reaching out to the internet and pulling data back. Generally, xSchedule doesn't access the internet unless you specifically set up maybe a curl request or something to do so in its normal mode. But look, it's up to you. But I would generally turn that stuff off, try and minimize those updates, those issues. I talked about making sure your adapters aren't on the same subnet. I've definitely seen issues with that. The other thing you want to be careful about is where you put your show folder. Ideally, you would put your show folder on a local hard disk in your machine. Do not put your show folder on a NAS drive. Very few NAS drives, no matter what they say on the outside of the box, deliver fast network performance and fast storage access. They're inherently much slower than a local drive. And I'd also be very careful about putting your show folder onto a USB stick or a USB attached hard disk, because again, the USB ports don't necessarily have as much bandwidth as you would like them to have, and therefore you can deliver quite slow experience. In terms of having a folder on your hard disk which is hooked up to OneDrive or Dropbox or Google Drive, etc., that can be okay, but you need to be wary of it. If the service, because these services run background processes which continue to check for changes and replicate changes backwards and forwards, and you may be relying on that for shipping your files from one computer to another. But sometimes they can lock the files or lead to small delays in accessing the file system, etc., and that could cause lag in your show. So if you are going to run it with Dropbox, etc., just avoid changing any of the content, and therefore having your drive service accessing your show while it's trying to play and causing issues there. So moving on, some other things. One of the other things to be wary of is the playlists and the schedules. You don't want to have too many playlists here and too many schedules for each playlist. And the reason you don't want to do that is because at a minimum, once a second, xSchedule's actually running through all of these things and looking at them and saying, is there anything I need to do? Do I need to start this, stop this, etc.? And the more playlists and schedules that you have, the more xSchedule has to go through and reevaluate all of the conditions around when something should play or when it shouldn't play. So just keep it thin, right? Here I've got 4, and I do have these 4. These 2 ones at the bottom I play from time to time. The animation only I play when people want to take a photo on my show. I turn it on. It puts up a wonderful light, all the lights, lots of butterfly, that sort of stuff, and people love that when they want to have a photo in front of the show. I also have my test patterns, which I run for an hour before my show starts, so that I can go out there and check that all my bulbs are working and I haven't lost colors, etc. And then I've got my main Christmas show. I have this old one, which is my Christmas long, which has a whole bunch of other things in it, which I don't use so much anymore, and I should probably remove this and stay true to this. Also, don't have too many schedules, because again, those schedules need to be reevaluated each time. So by all means have a few, even have 4 or 5, but you just don't go to town on it and add too many. Now this one's a little bit odd, but if you have a schedule here which is a fire once without the loop on, and you know that this thing runs for, 5 minutes or whatever, don't be setting the on time and the off time more than, 5 to 10 minutes apart, because even though the playlist has played for its 5 minutes and it's not going to loop, so it's not going to happen again, xSchedule has to keep reevaluating this thing as something that should be playing. And again, a bit more work that needs to be done at a critical time in the cycle, and you don't need that to be happening. Now, some other things that you may want to think about. If you're running video in your show, video can be particularly problematic, and there's a couple of things that you can do to try and improve the performance of video. Now, this was set up some time ago, so I'm actually not using the way I would recommend today. This has cache video on, but I'm not using the media player. By cache video, what happens is when the video goes to play, it runs around in the background reading the video in parallel while your show is playing and tries to stay ahead with a bunch of frames ready to be displayed. And that helps stop any sort of random lag in the playing back of video. If you use the native media player, which is what this one here is, xSchedule doesn't actually do all the video parsing. It actually leaves it to your inbuilt native media player in your computer. And my experience is that generally offers a better performance in playing back the video. However, you do lose this fade in and out. And as you can see, I'm using the fade in and out on this video. This is playing my virtual Santa. And I do kind of like the video to fade at the end rather than hard turn off. That looks a bit odd in my view. Fading in and out's not that easy, not that logical either, but hey, whatever, it is what it is. And so I would lose that if I went to the media player. So I'm using the cache video setting here when I'm playing the video. But yeah, video is definitely something can cause a problem, particularly if you have more than one video playing concurrently. I just have the one video and it's not too bad. It's also not full screen, so again, not too bad. If you're running full screen video on a high resolution projector, the amount of processing effort there can get really substantial, and I would definitely recommend you switch to using the inbuilt media player rather than a dedicated player. One other thing, so there's also these output processors. Now, most people do not use these, and to be honest, there's rarely situations when you do need to use them. In those few situations where you do, they can be wonderfully useful, and that's great. I would just caution you about having too many of these, because these things all represent processes that have to be run as xSchedule is trying to pump the data out. And so if you have too many of these doing too many things, it really slows things down, or it can slow things down. So if you feel the need to set the brightness, I would suggest you do brightness setting on the controller rather than doing brightness setting here in the output processing. Or at least a lot of it. But look, if you need to do a few channels here or there, or a couple of universes, etc., yeah, sure, knock yourself out. It's no big deal. But it's one of those things you can try, right? So if you're experiencing lag and you've got some output processors, then go in and turn those things off, and your performance may well improve. The other thing I didn't show in here is there is this thing called fast start audio. When your sequences are playing back, you will notice quite commonly the turtle will appear at the point that the song switches from one song to another. And that's typically down to two things. xSchedule's obviously opening up your new FSCQ file, but more significantly, it's opening up the audio file. And the audio file has to be read, it has to be converted into a format that is actually suitable for playing out the speakers on your computer. And while a lot of that happens in a background process and doesn't impact your show, there's enough work there that xSchedule doesn't quite keep up and drops a frame or two on the start. You generally can't see it in your display. It's no big deal, but if you'd like to avoid that, you can click this fast start audio button on each sequence. And what will happen is when your show starts, you'll get this bigger delay. And that bigger delay is because xSchedule is running through all of your songs, loading them all up, converting them all into the format ready to be played, and then just holding them in memory. So xSchedule will use a bit more memory because it's got all these audio files loaded in memory, ready to go. But you will see that the switch over between songs will be just that little bit faster. Again, look, I don't turn it on. It's just one more thing to have in memory, and I don't feel the need for it. I don't mind it if there's a micro delay between songs. I'm more worried about the micro delays that occur during the song. I would not do this if you have a playlist of 150 songs that you're randomly selecting from. You don't want to be doing fast start audio. You may well start your show, that playlist, and find that it spends 5 minutes reading all those audio files in and converting them, and that would probably be a worse experience. So yeah, don't be doing that. And I did promise a couple other things. The other thing I would definitely be doing is go up into Edit Options and set yourself up some buttons. And so, for example, down here are mine, and I've got a big collection of buttons down here. The standard ones, the play selected, stop all, next step, end gracefully, and add 10 minutes. You know, they're the standard ones that come with xSchedule, but you can add all of these other buttons down here. So I've got a test one here that just runs my test sequence so that, you know, at any time I need to turn the test on, I can turn it on and it will start playing. I have Christmas, which just launches my main playlist if I needed to kick it off manually for some reason. Reset Schedules is a really important button. It resets all my schedules. So if I do a stop all and then I want everything to start playing again as if the show hadn't stopped, Reset Schedules basically resets xSchedule back to its original state, and it will kick off the playlist as if it had been kicked off by the scheduler. The start animation and stop animation I use to play my photograph sequence, and so I start it and stop it. And the beauty of these two buttons is that they just suspend my Christmas show. So when I click the stop animation, my Christmas show picks up right back from where it was at, which is definitely great. I have the up and down volume so that I can control it easily on my phone. I also have a preset quiet and loud setting, which just jumps to a setting that I would prefer to have when there's no one around versus when there is. I have a mute for those times when people make too much noise, etc. I can just turn my show down to 0. And I also have a lights off and lights on for those circumstances where people are acting up, and I find turning the lights off and even if I leave the sequence playing, can be an incredibly powerful message to people that, hey, pull your head in, it's enough of whatever it is you're doing. And there's also a pause button here if I want to actually just pause the whole show. And finally, there is a stop test. So if I run the test, I can just stop the test. And again, that allows me to run the test without totally resetting the schedule if it happens to be running. So yeah, a bunch of different buttons. You absolutely want to take advantage of those. Now, the final two things that I want to show you are actually not in xSchedule, but they are utility programs that I have developed and made available. And the first one is TaskDaemon. You'll find these things in my Bitbucket, so write down this address up here because you'll want to download that. And when you get to it, if you click on this downloads button, it will give you a download link where you can click on download repository. It will download it. It's not a very big file. When you open the file up, in the case of this particular tool, if you go into the bin release folder, you want to copy these 3 files and put them somewhere on your machine. Put them into your show folder, that's fine. When you put it into your show folder, so let's do that. Let's go to my show folder here. Yeah. When you launch TaskDaemon, what it will do, and let me kill the scheduler for a moment. No, we don't want to save anything. When you launch the TaskDaemon, what it does is it'll open up a black box, which will appear on my other screen, and it just sits here. And what it's done is it's actually run xSchedule. it tells you here. So what it's doing is it's actually looking for xSchedule, and if xSchedule's not running, it will actually start it. And so you run this TaskDaemon, and you can put this in startup or something on your machine, and it will come up, and when it sees that xSchedule's not running, it kicks it off and says, okay, well, that's good, it's running. And then if xSchedule suddenly goes away, within a couple of seconds, it's detected that it's gone away, and it's relaunched it again. So it's basically providing a safety mechanism in ensuring that xSchedule's running. And if you come into xSchedule's options, and there's two options in here that you may want to set. One is this late starting scheduled sequence uses time to determine start location. And this is really cool. What this does is, if for some reason xSchedule, let's say you forgot to turn your computer on, and you turn your computer on 15 minutes after your show was due to start. So you kick off xSchedule launches, xSchedule realizes that, oh, hey, your show should have been playing, and normally it would start your show from the beginning of the show. If you have this late starting scheduled sequence, uses the time to determine start location, what xSchedule will actually do is it will work out where it would have been 15 minutes into the sequence or into the show, and it will actually kick the show off at that point. Now, that's actually not that useful in a situation where you forgot to run the computer, and you probably do want to run the computer from its starting point. But let's imagine that xSchedule had crashed. It had been in the middle of the show and it had crashed, and now you're restarting xSchedule. Well, do you want it to start from the beginning of your show, or do you want to pick it up pretty much where it left off? And so by having this checkbox checked, it will actually pick up pretty much from where it left off. The other thing that you want to do is change this behavior on crash from prompt user to one of these silently exit. The fastest responding will be the silently exit without crash log. Obviously, the problem with that is I don't get a copy of your crash log, so I don't fix the underlying problem. But you can have silently exit after sending the crash log, but that will obviously take a few moments longer because it will have to get busy sending the crash log to us. You can choose either though. And so what will happen now is if the show was playing and xSchedule crashes, so first of all, it won't prompt up with some dialog box asking you to say, well, do you want to send the crash log or not? It will just immediately disappear, just like it does when I click the close box here. And then the TaskDaemon will immediately kick back in, relaunch it, and literally within 5 seconds, your show is playing again, barely an interruption, minimizes that delay and that panicked run upstairs to turn it back on again and get it all going and try and get to the right song. All of that is dealt with seamlessly in that rare situation, hopefully rare situation when your show might crash. Now, when you do want to shut it down, you just need to remember to shut the black box first so that you can actually shut down xSchedule. But that's the TaskDaemon, a very useful utility to save yourself some time and some angst when you're running it. The other tool is this tool here called xSchedule Static ARP. Again, you want to come into the download folder and download it. I do run this on my show. I find that, and this never used to be true on Windows, but it seems to have become a problem over the last couple of years. I don't know when or what Microsoft changed, but they seem to have changed something. Whereas previously, if a controller went offline, my Windows machine didn't seem to really care. Everything just kept playing as normal. It was no big deal. Nowadays, if a controller goes offline, then I find I get this dreadful lag in my show. And the reason the lag occurs is because of these ARP tables. Now, what is ARP? Well, there's commonly there's a bit of a misnomer around IP addresses and how computers talk to things. While IP addresses are obviously the way in which you address your controllers, they're not actually how the network works. The network actually relies on these physical addresses, also known as MAC addresses. And the computer maintains this table, which you can access by typing in this command ARP-A, and it shows the association between the IP addresses and the physical address. And so if I try to ping a device out there, which the computer has never spoken to before on my network, or at least spoken to recently on my network, it won't be in this ARP table, and so it won't know what its physical address is, and therefore how to talk to it. And so what the computer will do is it will send out a broadcast packet onto the network, which will ask everything on the network, are any of you the owners of this IP address? And then that machine will respond back with an answer and say, yeah, that's me, and here is my MAC address, and the ARP program will store that away inside this table and keep it there for a period of time. I've seen various measures, but something like 45 seconds or thereabouts in the table, and reuse it. And so if you try to send another packet within that 45 seconds, it doesn't have to do this lookup onto the network. Now the challenge is what happens if it sends out this broadcast packet and no one responds? Well, in that case, it has to wait a period of time in order to decide that no one has responded, and then it has to silently drop the sending of the packet. Now, the problem is that delay while it waits to see if anything is going to respond starts to bleed into your show and cause delays in sending out the data. And that's a real problem. This is a problem that the FPP also had quite some time ago, where it was always true that if your controllers would go offline, FPP would start to lag, and it was a similar underlying reason. Now, Dan's implemented in FPP a mechanism which monitors the controllers out there, and if they stop responding, then he stops sending data to them. And I showed you earlier a checkbox in xSchedule which does a similar thing. He pings a little bit more often, so it recovers a little bit more quickly, but that's how he tries to manage this particular situation. The downside of that, obviously, is if it's a transitory loss of a ping packet, or it was just, I don't know, the controller for some reason didn't see the message or whatever, then you can lose controllers out of your show. And I think there's been a few issues recently which sounded to me like they were related to FPP thinking that controllers were offline that maybe weren't offline, and then not sending data for a period, etc., which makes the show look like it's frozen. And so forth. So the question is, well, what can you do about it? How do I stop it being so random? And this is where this tool comes in that I've done. So let's download this tool and open it up. And again, all the source code is here for you, so if you're curious about what it's doing and how it does it. This is a Windows-only tool, as is the last tool. I knock my really simple utilities up in .NET, so I don't spend as much time worrying about making them cross-platform. And to be honest, this is very Windows-specific, so it's not that useful on another platform. So in the bin folder, there's actually just the executable, and that's the only thing that you need to bring down. So how does that work? Well, let's go back to our show folder, which is where I happen to have put a copy of this program. So here it is here, the xLite Static ARP. So you run this program and it comes up and it asks for your show folder. So we want to click on the ellipsis and go into our show folder. All right, there's my show folder there. And I click on generate. And what it's going to do is it's going to generate two files in my show folder. And that's all it does. It just generates two files, the clear ARP and the static ARP.cmd. Now, when you run this program, it is super, super, super critical that all of your controllers are online and working. xSchedule's ping window should be all green. Everything needs to be good, because if everything is not good, then this program is going to generate a file that could make your show worse, not better, right? So you want to make sure it's good. Now, these two programs, Clear ARP basically is an undo, restores your machine back to its original state, and the Static ARP program is the one that puts your computer in the state. Now, the reason I generate these CMD files rather than just changing your computer is because these things actually need to run as administrator, and I felt it was more appropriate that you would come in here, right-click and do Run as Administrator, rather than me just asking you to run that program as administrator. administrator. That's the only reason. The other reason, being command files, you can obviously run these on and off anytime you want. You need to run both of them as administrator though to have any changes. So let's take a quick look at them to see what they've done. And the reason I didn't run it on my machine is because my machine is not on my computer, not on my show computer. These controllers are not reachable, and so this would actually generate an invalid file, and I'll show that to you in a second. So the first command up here just basically deletes any of these static routes that happen to be in place already. It deletes all of the static routes on my local area connection on this computer. It then goes and adds in a static route. So this is my controller's IP address, and this is the MAC address of that controller. Now, obviously, if I swap my controller out and put a new controller in, this won't be valid. At that point, you'll have to go back, clear it all out, rerun the program, regenerate this table, and run it again. And this runs for each of my controllers, and then at the end it runs a show which basically lists for you all of the settings which are in force at that point. Once this is in place, the computer no longer ever has to broadcast out to find out what the MAC address of the controller is, because it's now hard-coded within the computer. Now that becomes an issue, that becomes an issue if the controller changes or its IP address changes. That would be a problem. But as long as you're not changing your hardware, and during your show you're generally not, this is really good. And then if you do want to change anything, just run the clear, regenerate the scripts, and off you go again. Now, when the controller goes offline, the computer doesn't need to send out that broadcast packet because it still thinks it knows what the ARP entry is, and it will just use that. And that's how this helps solve for those micro delays due to the ARP tables, or the ARP tables not having the particular controller in them. So let's run this again, but let's run it on this computer, which we didn't do. Let's run it here. So let's click Generate. And it's showing it to me down here. So notice that in this case here, it hasn't generated any entries at all. They're all blank. And the reason for that is my computer can't actually see any of those controllers. So it didn't put anything in here. So if this comes up and your controllers aren't here, or none of your controllers are here, or some of them are missing, that would be a sign that the controllers are offline, and therefore this tool could not generate all the necessary entries. And so you should go back and get those controllers online and then rerun it until this script is complete and correct. So that's my Hail Mary. If all else fails, I tend to go to that program as a way to solve issues. And again, you can find this thing in my Bitbucket. You can download this utility and use it on your Windows machine. So a whole bunch of ideas there around how to optimize your computer, how to optimize your xSchedule setup, some utilities that you can use to have a better experience running xSchedule. And look, this will largely be relevant, I think, in 2021 as much as it was in 2020. The xSchedule engine has not been changing dramatically. It definitely hasn't changed very dramatically this year. There's a couple of minor improvements here and there, but the fundamentals are still very much the same. So thank you, guys.